The only lands that Bartholomew Kennedy owned in 1972 were the lands known as Killkillahara, folio 6265F, which he had inherited from his uncle. Bartholomew, or Batty as he was also known, was a single man who suffered from schizophrenia and could not read or write. Because Batty wasn't capable of maintaining the land, he asked his brother Tom to buy it from him. Tom agreed to buy the land, and the price of £12,000 was agreed. The two brothers went to the office of Butler, Cunningham and Maloney solicitors in Templemore, County Tipperary, and signed a contract in the presence of solicitor Augustine Cunningham. Tom paid £3,000 deposit in February 1972, and 2 months later paid the remaining £9,000 to Mr. Cunningham. Tom farmed the Killkillahara lands for 29 years without complaint. But in 2001, after his brother Batty died, everything changed. In actual fact, the problems had begun years earlier. Solicitor Gus Cunningham had never carried out the transfer of Killkillahara from Batty to Tom. This remained the case from 1972 up until 1993, when Gus Cunningham retired from the practice.
I says to Mr. Cunningham when he was retired, I says, you have to fix this before you go. And the answer I got back from him was I was executor in the will and I had nothing to worry about and he'd sort it out. And it never happened.
Gus Cunningham retired in 1993 and the practice was taken over by Paddy Cadell. In the years that followed, and unbeknownst to Tom, at least 4 sites on the Killkillahara land were sold without Tom's knowledge or consent, one of which was to a local man named Patsy Leahy.
I objected to Mr. Patsy Leahy taking over a field of mine. Mr. Cadell sold it and he got me brother Batty, who couldn't read or write, to sign the sale. And I refused to accept it. And I hadn't a proof of ownership at that time. And it was fought in the courts. And because I hadn't proof of ownership, I couldn't win the case.
Parts of Tom's land continued to be sold on him, and whenever he tried to retake possession, he was arrested, charged with contempt of court, and imprisoned.
I was over 3 years in prison. I was arrested 6 times for contempt of court and put in prison.
The only way the Kennedys could see of protecting Batty and the land at Killkillahara from Paddy Cadell was to make Batty a ward of court. When Paddy Cadell heard about this plan, he contacted Batty's doctor, Dr. Joe Hennessy, and he asked him if he would certify that Batty was of sound mind. Dr. Hennessy declined to do so and reported the matter to the Tipperary North Mental Health Services. The unlawful selling of the Killkillahara lands continued up until the time of Batty's death in 2001.
When Batty died, I looked after him all my life, and when Batty died, I notified Mr. Cunningham. I asked him, had Batty any wishes that we'd have to do everything properly? And Mr. Cunningham told me he wouldn't have his will. It was inside in the office. And to contact Mr. Cadell, and he'd go up and check it. I contacted Mr. Cadell. He went up to the office and checked it, and he rang me back and he says, you can work away, there was nothing to worry about. A number of days after his burial, I contacted Mr. Cadell and I asked him, I wanted to see Batty's will. And he says he'd have to get on to the executors of the will. He didn't tell me that the Sunday beforehand, and I was shocked finding out this. And the next thing, I got a letter in the post a number of days later saying that the executors had agreed to send me a copy of the will. And the executors were Mr. Cunningham and Owen Harrihill. And none of these were blood relatives of Batty. And with Batty's mental conditions, our family was looking after Batty for 30 years. And this didn't sound right.
Tom maintains that Gus Cunningham told him in 1993, prior to retiring from a solicitor's practice, that Batty had made a will and that he, Tom, was the executor of that will. That will, however, was never found, and the will that was produced after Batty's death was dated the 30th of October 1996. Although Batty had 4 siblings, 2 sisters and 2 brothers, one of which being Tom, who was his guardian according to the mental health services, no blood relative was listed as executor on Batty's will. Instead, the executors were Gus Cunningham, solicitor, and publican Owen Harrahill.
Owen Harrahill is living in Templemore in Main Street. He's a publican. He's a brother of Billy Harrahill, who is married to my sister. We didn't trust the Harrahills at all. And we were surprised that any of the Harrahills would be involved in this or in Batty's will. And Batty's will states, I leave all my property to my 2 sisters, Maura and Joan. And it doesn't state what his property was. The will was made by Paddy Cadell, and the executors were, as I said, Gus Cunningham and Owen Harrahill. When this broke, my sisters were led to believe by the solicitors that Killkillahara was part of the estate, which was not. Killkillahara wasn't in the will or a part of the will.
At the time of his death, the only property that Batty owned was his home on Bank Street, Templemore, County Tipperary, which he had bought with the proceeds from the sale of Killkillahara to his brother Tom in 1972. Killkillahara was the only property Batty owned in 1972. Due to the fact that the title of the Killkillahara lands had never been transferred into Tom's name, and because Tom couldn't find his receipts or any proof of purchase, he would be relying on the solicitors to produce the proof of payment and the contract of sale in court. The probate was dealt with in Thurles District Court in October 2003 by Judge Olive Buttermore. Paddy Cadell withheld the contract of sale and the proof of payment from the court. Gus Cunningham was asked what Tom had paid £12,000 for in 1972. He couldn't answer the question, but he didn't deny receiving the money. Judge Buttermore failed to dig any deeper on the issue and probated the Killkillahara lands.
Judge Buttermore gave the probate of my property, and I couldn't prove that I owned the property because the documents were withheld from the court. I required the contract of sale and the proof of payment. And after the case, in December 2003, I found the proof of payment. And when the appeal came on in February, it was before Judge Hardiman. I had collapsed the day before and brought to hospital. I was told that I wasn't to go to court, and I sent in a doctor's cert. When I sent in the doctor's cert, the case shouldn't have been heard because I didn't have a solicitor representing me. So the case should have been adjourned, and it wasn't. And Judge Hardiman accepted Judge Olive Buttermore's ruling.
Although Tom had lost in the appeal of the probate, he now had proof that he paid Butler, Cunningham and Maloney solicitors £12,000 in 1972. A few months later, Tom had an opportunity to present this proof of payment to the court. A trespass case had been initiated against him in 2002, and it was back before the court in May 2004.
When I brought the documents into court, I produced them to Judge Buttermore, and she ran off the bench. She didn't want to hear about it. The case was heard in Thurles a month later, and when the case was heard a month later, Mr. Cadell brought in the contract with these exhibits attached to it.
When Tom found the proof of payment, proving that he did purchase something in 1972 for £12,000 in the offices of Butler, Cunningham and Maloney solicitors, Paddy Cadell produced a contract of sale, which had been withheld from the courts throughout the probate case. The contract that Tom remembers signing in 1972 was a one-page document. The contract that Paddy Cadell produced in court in May 2004, however, had a number of pages attached.
When I produced the proof of payment to the courts, Mr. Cadell brought in the contract of sale, and the contract of sale, he had exhibits attached to it, which were not attached when I signed it in 1972. And page 2 of the contract of sale was all the lands comprising in folio 24284 vendor Bartholomew Kennedy. Bartholomew Kennedy couldn't sell what he didn't own. It was my mother's property, as the folios prove.
The exhibits that were added to the contract made it look like Tom didn't buy Killkillahara, folio 6265F, from his brother, but instead bought the land known as Atnet Moor, folio 24284. This was not possible. Batty never owned this land, and therefore Tom couldn't have bought it from him. For whatever reason, numerous judges failed to spot the fraud being committed, starting with Judge Buttimer. She didn't question the additional pages of the contract, and she ruled against Tom in the trespass case. Judge Charlton granted a judicial review of the trespass case, and Judge O'Neill was appointed to hear it. Paddy Cadell objected to Judge O'Neill hearing the judicial review and approached the President of the High Court on the matter. The President of the High Court, Richard Johnson, appointed Judge McKechnie to hear all future cases relating to the matter. In 2005, Tom initiated the ownership case against the sole surviving executor of Batty's will, Owen Harrahill. Judge McKechnie decided that he would hear the ownership case, but he refused to hear the judicial review of the trespass case. The ownership case finished in December 2009, and McKechnie gave his judgment in June 2010. In his summing up, he stated, "This issue is a simple and straightforward one. Is the plaintiff, Tom Kennedy, the owner of certain lands at Killkillahara, comprised in folio 6265F, County Tipperary? Mr. Kennedy claims that in 1972 he purchased these lands from his brother Bartholomew, who died in 2001. This is contested by Mr. Owen Harrahill, the sole surviving executor of that estate, who defends the assertion on the basis that the lands purchased in 1972 were those situated at Atnet Moor, comprised in folio 24284, County Tipperary." Judge McKechnie ruled in favour of publican Owen Harrahill, believing that Tom did not buy the lands at Killkillahara, comprised in folio 6265F, but instead it was the Atnet Moor lands, comprised in folio 24284, which he purchased from his brother Batty in 1972. McKechnie also made an Isaac Wonder order against Tom, preventing him from appealing the decision and from ever again challenging Owen Harrahill as the executor of Batty's estate, which now included the lands at Killkillahara. Judge McKechnie, who was appointed to the Supreme Court within weeks of delivering this judgment, didn't examine the folio numbers in any detail and never questioned the integrity of the disputed second page of the contract. Judge McKechnie seriously erred in law. Batty was never the registered owner on any of the Atnet Moor lands. The Atnet Moor lands were owned by Tom and Batty's mother, Mary Kennedy. Mary Kennedy held absolute title on the Atnet Moor lands from 1946 up until 1993. During this time, the Atnet Moor lands were transferred into different folios, but Mary Kennedy always remained the absolute title holder. In 1968, the Atnet Moor lands were transferred from folio 24284 into folio 38484, and folio 24284 was thereupon closed. This is proven in land registry documents. Here we can see the land registry document for the Atnet Moor lands, contained within folio 24284. At the bottom of the second page of this land registry document, beside the date, the 7th of November 1968, it says, "The title to the property has been transferred to folio 38484. This folio is closed." If folio 24284 was closed in 1968, how then could it be included in a contract for sale 4 years later, in 1972? Additional land registry documents from 1976 present further proof that Tom couldn't have bought the Atnet Moor lands from his brother. In 1976, Tom and his wife Bridget bought a site on the Atnet Moor lands. The site was approximately 3/4 of an acre in size and was for the purpose of building their home on. The schedule within the land registry document states that the sale relates to part of the lands on folio 38484. If what Paddy Cadell, Owen Harrahill and the Irish courts say is true, that in 1972 Batty sold Tom the Atnid Moorlands, how then could land registry documents show that Tom and his wife bought part of these same Atnid Moorlands again 4 years later, from Mary Kennedy? As stated earlier, Mary Kennedy was the absolute title holder of the Atnid Moorlands from 1946 up until 1993. As absolute title holder, Mary Kennedy was the only person able to sell these lands. Batty's name is stated nowhere in relation to the Atnid Moor folios. He never owned the Atnid Moorlands and therefore he could never sell them. If there was still any doubt as to what land Tom bought from his brother Batty in 1972, the question should have been asked, why was Tom given possession of Killkillahara, folio 6265F, in 1972, and farmed it for 29 years without complaint from anyone? The fact is that Batty inherited the Killkillahara lands from his uncle. Batty was a single man suffering with schizophrenia who couldn't read or write. His brother Tom, who took care of him for 30 years and was his guardian, agreed to buy the land off Batty for a price of £12,000 in 1972. With the proceeds of the sale, Batty bought a house on Bank Street, Templemore, County Tipperary. Tom was given possession of the Killkillahara lands and he farmed them without complaint from anyone up until his brother Batty died in 2001. It was only at this stage when all of Tom's problems began. To this day, Tom is still fighting in the courts to get his land back.